Good morning. Glad to see everybody here today. Appreciate your being here. Particularly if you're a guest, we welcome you back. Hope that you'll come anytime that you have the opportunity. I believe we have a few out today, still spring break I suppose, but maybe they'll be back shortly. Today we're going to talk about the widow and her two mites, a familiar story to anybody who's read the New Testament. And we're going to talk about generosity in that vein. Some people seem to be naturally generous. I've met some, I believe. And some of us, like me, have a little greater difficulty with being generous. It's harder to share what we have. Perhaps for a host of reasons people feel that way. The second group might be because they didn't have a lot in the former part of their lives. Or it could be perhaps that they're just selfish. Sharing is difficult. But there are those who, because they have been impoverished or didn't have a lot, know just how hard it is to be in that situation and are that much more generous for it, despite what it may take out of their pocketbook. Some people may love money, like the rich man in the story in the Bible, who just loved that money and put it away. We'll read about him in a little bit. And some people maybe believe that if they give away what they need, they won't have enough. Or maybe their reasoning is that cause or that person is not worthy of my helping. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes there are those who are just deadbeats who aren't really trying to help themselves. And we're less inclined to help out that person, even if perhaps he needs it. A careful person may figure he's going to run out of what he needs. And of course, in that way, he needs to perhaps think a little bit more about the providence of God and that God has promised that people that live for Him are going to be taken care of. God even tells us to be careful, to take care of our families. 1 Timothy 5:8 says we need to be diligent about that because he who will not care for his family has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. I recall once upon a time, someone who called where I was preaching at the time needed some help. It turns out her son had come into town for a visit, and she didn't have groceries enough for him. What she didn't know is I drove that way to work most every day, and I could see that he had a big, fine RV sitting out in her driveway, and probably had enough money to feed Mama, really, when it came right down to it. And so I wasn't inclined to help too much, and seeing as they had plenty, he could have helped his mama. But for some reason, that wasn't going on. Some people, as Paul talked about in 2 Corinthians 8, need to grow in this grace also. He had to encourage that church at Corinth to fulfill a promise they had made to help out the poor widows in Jerusalem. In 2 Corinthians 8, he says, I speak not by commandment, but by a testing of your sincerity, of your love, by the diligence of others. For you know the grace of God, grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, that you through his poverty might become rich. And someone might say, well, Paul's kind of putting the pressure on them, and I think you'd be right. He's trying to get people to remember what they do have, what's been done for them, and how that should turn out in their own lives. The widow's two mites we're going to look at under these 5 headings. Generosity's meaning, its manifestations, its motivations, its might, and its magnificence. Each starting with the same letter, being a little bit more memorable in that way, perhaps. In the context of what we're looking at, Jesus has been teaching the crowd, and in Luke 20:45, he said in the hearing of all the people, he said to his disciples, beware of the scribes who desire to go around in long robes. They love greetings in the marketplace. They love the best seats in the synagogues and the best places at feasts. In other words, they felt entitled, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. These will receive the greater condemnation. So what Jesus is mostly talking about here is hypocrisy. That these fellows wanted to be known for how good they were when in fact they weren't very good at all. They were people who basically lived off widows. And there's always a possibility, there's always a danger to being that kind of a hypocrite, to live off other people in your income on life. In Luke, the 21st chapter, I'm paralleling here the story of the little widow lady from two different translations. I'll be reading from the one on the right-hand side. He looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury. And he saw a certain poor widow putting in 2 small copper coins. The King James says, casting in thither 2 mites, a mite being the smallest of coins. And he said, truly, I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them, for they all put in out of their surplus into the offering. But she, out of her poverty, put in all that she had to live on. Apparently, at least for that day, she had no more. We don't know much else about her. In fact, I don't know of anything else the Bible tells us about the plight of this poor lady, except that she was impoverished and generous. The lepton, which is the mite, the coin that's mentioned here, according to Scofield's study Bible, was the smallest coin, and he paralleled in Mark 12 and Luke 12. And it was 1/2 of what we might call a penny, but it was worth only about 1/8 of a cent. And I must say that this is kind of an old reference book. It would be less than that today. She had less than a penny to live on. I don't know what it took to live in that day, but certainly Jesus is trying to show the poorest of the poor. Here was a woman who had only 2 of these little coins, and she put them in anyway. Her bounty was small in an amount, but the significance of it was boundless. It showed a lot about what she considered to be important, what she considered her duty, and for that matter, her privilege, which was to support the work of the Lord in her day in the Jewish religion. Her faith was great indeed. She trusted that she would still go on living, that someone would help her, that God would bless her in the amount needed for her to get by. The gifts that we look at here, the Sadducees, were giving, really, relatively speaking, a small amount. These were the elite of society for that day, in that culture. They had the most. They were the wealthy folks. They went around as the high priest and all of his company, and they were the rulers according to the law in that day. And they seemed really more about trying to get public acclaim than they did about actually concerning themselves with what would honor the Lord. And of course, that's really part of the reason for the contribution that they were giving, was they were to be honoring the Lord and helping to take care of those who needed that help. Really, they could have given more. And really, the important matter perhaps is they could have given with an acceptable outlook, motivation, whereas really what they were doing was just putting in what it would take to look good in society. The widow, on the other hand, by contrast, gave all she had to live on that day. And I suppose that perhaps someone could have fed her, but for all we know, according to the story, she could have gone hungry that day. She didn't draw a lot of attention to herself, and she didn't mean to. She meant only for this to be between her and the Lord. And again, another principle of contributing to the Lord, of giving of what we have, is that it is between us and the Lord, primarily. Well, that doesn't mean that it might not be incidentally known by other people, but it does question or bring into question our motivation for what we're doing. Are we doing it to impress people, or are we doing it to honor God and perhaps impress Him with our love for Him? She gave it out of that pure heart that honors God. And for that reason, Jesus has included her in the Bible. And wherever the Bible is read, people will know, though they do not know her name, they will know that there was one honorable widow in Israel who did what was needed and did what was right. I'd like to turn to what she did under the heading of the meaning of generosity. I've mentioned natural generosity, people who seem to simply be ready and willing to share with other people. But for some of us, generosity is more a learned thing, an overcoming of reluctance, an overcoming of perhaps a bit of miserly tendency. Some of us have to learn the joy, Jesus said, is more blessed to give than it is to receive, Acts 20:35. And so the idea of being blessed there is that it's something that makes us to feel better, and for that matter, to stand better in God's sight. So do we do that? Which one am I, a natural giver or one who has to grow in this grace also? And then there are those who are just plain stingy. They wouldn't give more than $1 or $2 if they had $1 million to give. That's just the way they are. They could do more, but they're not generous to God. And the question again is, which one of these do I fit into? Am I naturally generous? Am I one who's learning to be generous, or am I just tight-fisted? I just keep it all to myself. Which one do I really wish to be? And the wish to be one or the other of these is going to help in the outcome. If I'm going to become one who learns generosity, or am I just satisfied with giving the bare minimum to get by, to be able to put my hand over a plate and drop in a coin or two, a dollar bill or two? With the way inflation is going, a dollar bill doesn't go far anymore, certainly doesn't at the grocery store. And so we understand something about what generosity means. I think it's true that rich people can be very generous, and that some poor people can be just the opposite. So it's not always a matter of how much we have, but what is our heart? What is our attitude? What is the goal that we have in giving? Is it to fulfill merely an obligation, or is it to accomplish good as we give? The question for me, and maybe for you, is, am I generous? What describes me best? The definitions are many. I looked up a few. Generosity is kindness. It is being big-hearted. It is being open-handed, in other words, sharing with others. It is sometimes called liberality. It can be a bountiful nature. It can be charitableness or charity. The antonym of it is to be miserly, to be tight-fisted, to be stingy. And so we have no trouble understanding what it means. Perhaps we have understanding or problems understanding what the application of it is. But which one am I? Am I giving just the bare minimum to say I've given? Or have I learned some joy in giving because I see a good accomplished? The manifestations of generosity are not just in putting money in a contribution plate, although that's one way it can be expressed. Monetary aid to the poor might be there. James 1:27 says, pure religion and undefiled before God is to visit the fatherless and the widows in their afflictions, and keep oneself unspotted from the world. Certainly, we need to visit in the sense of seeing to the needs of those among us who have great need. There is comforting the afflicted. In 2 Timothy 5 and verse 10, the principle is taught that when people are down and out, we comfort them. And I have said before, and I'll say it again, I perceive this congregation to be very generous, very open-handed, very open-hearted. And for that, I want to commend you for what little my commendation means. But more than that, I believe the Lord is pleased that you have such big hearts, that you are so open to doing things for other people. I think particularly recently of the aid given because of the tornadoes up in Kentucky, a great outpouring of generosity. There is solace to the sad whenever we have someone who has lost someone else, or who has had a great reversal in his life. Romans 12:15 says, rejoice with those who rejoice and sorrow with those who sorrow. And so that brings us to the second one, is having joy at someone else's joy. The purpose or the principle behind that is I'm compassionate, I am empathizing with someone else. And so generosity can show itself in empathy. There's understanding of the misunderstood. I can't think of anyone in all the Bible who was more misunderstood than Job by his so-called friends, who believed that he was suffering hardships because he was an evil man. Now, you might argue that Jesus was misunderstood, and that would be true. But of mere mortals, Job would be the example I would go to. Compassion and generosity can be seen in dealing with someone who is misunderstood, or perhaps who can't express his own needs very much. There is forgiveness to those who are in sin. Galatians 6 says, if any of you is overcome by sin, those of you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of meekness, lest you also be tempted. And bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of the Lord. We need to be people who are not looking to condemn, but are looking to restore. We're not looking to find fault, but we're looking for a way to help that person overcome whatever is wrong in his life. But with humility, knowing that we could be the victim of a sin ourselves. We could fall into it. There is giving the benefit of the doubt. I think generosity is seen when Paul talked about love believes all things, that it gives the benefit of the doubt when there is a doubt to be considered. We can be generous in our interpretation of what someone else does until we're forced to believe otherwise. And so it is that we look at somebody who appears to be in the wrong and we try to find ways perhaps to see his point of view. There's encouragement to the fearful. It is a generous thing to go up and encourage someone. Luke 12:32, Jesus said to his disciples, "Fear not, little flock." He was trying to help them to be brave in the face of what they considered to be difficulties. And that's another way we can show generosity, that we can encourage other people. So whether it's time or money, patience or understanding, consideration of their needs, whatever it may be, there are multiple ways for us to be generous to other people. Generosity's motivations we've already hinted at. There's duty. What should I do because it's the right thing to do? What does God command? What does God expect? In fact, for that matter, what is honorable in society? All of those can go into generosity. Again, there are the benefits and the costs. What is this going to cost me? What are the benefits that will accrue to it? There is a reward. There's a punishment or a downside, you might say, if we're not generous. There's the outcome of the action itself. Maybe a hungry person will no longer be hungry. Maybe a downhearted person will be lifted up. That's the outcome of our actions on other people. Are we looking merely to our own good? Or as Paul said, are we looking to the good of others also in Philippians? There's a love for God and people. If the commandments were love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and soul and strength and mind, and thy neighbor as thyself, these are the first and great commandments. And all of the prophets and the Bible are based upon that. Then we see there's a great need and a meaning in loving people. It's the highest of all motivations. 1 John 3 says, let us not love in word, but in deed and in truth. If we see our brother in need and close our hearts to them, how can we say the love of God dwells in us? You see, generosity says something about our insides. In Matthew 6, chapter 6 and verse 1, Jesus says, take heed that you don't do your charitable deeds before men in order to be seen by them. And I think that's a key phrase in this. Not they couldn't see it, but what's our motivation in doing things? Is it for their viewing or is it for God's viewing? Otherwise, you have no reward from your Father in heaven. But when you do a charitable deed, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. In other words, be secretive about it. Be quiet about it. So that your charitable deed may be in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will himself reward you openly. There should be the prominent principle that we would follow when we're trying to be generous. In Luke 6:38, Jesus gave another principle: give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your bosom. For with the same measure you use, it will be measured back to you. I think we sometimes say what goes around comes around. And I believe that Jesus is giving some credence to that. In 1 John 3:17, if you have this world's goods and see a brother in need, shut up your heart from him. How does the love of God abide in him, my little children? Let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth, as we referred to before. 2 Corinthians 9, Paul was again encouraging those people to make good on their pledge to help out the poor widows in Jerusalem. And he reminds them of the principle that he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will reap bountifully. So put yourself into it. There's something to be said for going headlong into what you believe is a good thing. So let each give as he purposes in his heart. Nobody's scripting you. Nobody is forcing you to do a certain amount or a certain way or to a certain charity, but not grudgingly or necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. Once again, we find that the principle, first and foremost, is what our attitude is. What is our motivation? Because if we have a good attitude and a good motivation, that's going to lead us into doing things that are perhaps more generous than we thought we could. In Luke 12, he spoke a parable to them, saying, the ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, what shall I do since I have no room to store my crops? And those of you who are farmers don't often have that problem. This fellow was an exceptional guy. So he said, I'll do this. I'll pull down my barns, a foolish thought in itself. I'll build greater, and there I will store all my crops and goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will these things be that you have provided? The principle is not that God is against wealth. The principle is that God is against stinginess, against being miserly, against the attitude that it's all about me and not about someone else. And then finally Jesus says, so is he who lays up treasure for himself but is not rich toward God. To me, that particular verse has stuck in my mind a good deal. That the principle is being rich toward God in whatever form that may take. Generosity's might comes in several ways. It can lift fallen people. Someone who has come upon hard times can be brought out of the gutter and brought back to a measure of self-respect. Generosity can encourage people who are sad, because I take the time, you take the time to go to someone who is in a hurtful position, someone who has fallen on hard times, who has a death in the family, a sadness in the family, and in some way, maybe indirect, maybe direct, we encourage that person that there's someone thinking about you, someone who's praying for you, someone you could talk to if you choose to, and someone who's expressing the love of God in your behalf. Then we can lift up that sad person. Generosity can improve my character. Had you ever thought about the fact that giving really gives back to you? We come back to that verse about it's more blessed to give than to receive. That there are some ways in which when we give something to someone else that we didn't have to give, that we've improved ourselves, that we've become better people, that we, in fact, are a little more like Jesus on that day. And it might simply be that our good attitude is growing, that we are becoming more like God would have us. Generosity accomplishes many good works, and it is to that we look. It can be in the local church. That's one way we express it every week. Those of us who put into those plates sitting on the tables, why we are in some way trying to help the local church to do what it does. But it can be even wider. It can be worldwide evangelism. Some of you may give to evangelistic works on your own in private. You may give to a children's home. You may help the poor and the downtrodden. There are multiple ways for you to do it, all of them being good. Generosity then is magnificent. We talked about how it changes the giver. And we talked about this verse of being more blessed to give than to receive. John 3:16 talks about how God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever should believe in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. The fact that God is generous to us is an indication that he wishes for us to be generous to those around about us. Generosity gives where it might keep. It loves where it might not care. It goes beyond the mere minimum requirements. Generosity is about plentiful giving. Generosity, question for us today. Am I generous? Do I give just the bare minimum of my time, of my efforts, of my care, of my prayers, of my love, and yes, even of what I have in the bank? Do I give the bare minimum to good works? Or am I finding joy in seeing what my generosity can do for other people? What are my motives? To be seen of people or as a show of faith in God, which should be our motivation? And what is our standing before God? If God does indeed love a cheerful giver, and we see someone who is in need, then we go to our text for the day. As we have opportunity, let us do good unto all people, but especially those of the household of faith. That is the call that God will place upon us, that we be people who find gratification and satisfaction in copying our Holy Father and our elder brother in being generous for the cause of generosity. Today, we leave you with the call from God to be generous so that it may be given back to you. But also today, there is the plea that you become a Christian. Out of God's generosity, he redeems the world, but we have to accept that redemption through believing in Jesus, repenting our sins, professing our faith and being baptized. If you've not yet done that, we're going to sing a song to encourage you to come forward and let us know you wish to do that. And if it is a prayer need that you have today, then you can let us know at the same time what your prayer need is. Whatever it may be, why don't you please let us know while together we stand and as we sing.